Hey there, traveler. Before you drift off tonight, let's step back way back to a time when winters were long, dark, and brutally cold. The time of the Vikings. No electric heaters, no cozy pajamas, no steaming mugs of cocoa, just men, women, and children trying to survive the frozen north. But here's the thing, they didn't just survive, they thrived. They laughed, sang, told stories, and slept soundly while snow buried their world outside. How did they do it? How did the Vikings keep warm enough to sleep through nights that could kill a person in hours? Tonight, we'll sail through their world, 20 quiet chapters filled with firelight, fur blankets, and the secrets of Norse winter life. So, lie back, breathe slowly, and imagine the crackle of a hearth fire glowing against wooden walls. Our journey begins. Winter in the Viking world wasn't just a season, it was a test. The sun disappeared early, leaving behind a heavy gray sky and air that stung the lungs. Snow fell for weeks, sometimes months, until the roofs of longhouses looked like white hills. Outside, rivers froze solid, livestock huddled close to barns, and the sea turned cruel, locking ships in ice. The Vikings called this time the deep winter, a word that would later become Yule. It wasn't just cold, it was survival. Inside, families retreated to the heart of their homes, the longhouse. It was more than a building, it was life itself. The air smelled of smoke and pine. The walls, built of thick logs and turf, kept the biting wind out. One long fire burned down the center, its light flickering against the rafters. Above, smoke crept slowly through a narrow hole in the roof, curling like ghosts into the night. The floor was packed earth, covered in straw and animal skins. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. The Vikings were masters of using what they had. When night fell, and it fell early, families gathered close to the fire. They ate, talked, and told old tales of gods and monsters. Children curled against their mothers, dogs stretched near the warmth, and the fire became the heart of everything. They slept shoulder to shoulder, sometimes 10 or more in one space, wrapped in layers of fur and wool. The warmth of the fire mixed with body heat and thick walls to create a bubble of comfort amid the endless cold. But this was only the beginning of how they survived. The Vikings didn't rely on luck. They had ancient wisdom passed down from generations who'd faced winters even harsher than theirs. And as we drift further into their frozen world, we'll uncover their small, clever tricks, the kind that meant the difference between life and death when the north wind howled outside. So, stay close to the fire, listener. The snow is falling, and our story is just getting warm. Inside the Viking world, survival began with the home, the longhouse. From the outside, it didn't look like much, just a long, low structure made of wood, turf, and stone, with a roof that almost touched the ground. But inside, it was the difference between life and death. Imagine stepping through the heavy wooden door on a dark winter evening. The wind howls behind you, a wild, freezing scream. Snow follows you in, swirling for a moment before melting on the warm earth floor. You pull the door shut, and suddenly, the world outside disappears. It's dim and smoky inside, but there's a glow ahead, the hearth. The fire burns long and low in the center, its orange light flickering against the rough beams above. You can hear it crackle softly, the smell of burning pine mixing with cooked meat and wool. This was the heart of Viking life. Every longhouse had one central fire pit, stretching like a glowing ribbon down the middle of the floor. The smoke rose slowly through a small opening in the roof. Not perfectly, of course, so the air always had a hint of haze. The Vikings didn't mind. That smoke actually helped preserve the wooden beams above, keeping away mold and insects. The warmth didn't just come from the flames. It came from the people. Dozens could live under one roof, families, servants, even animals. They all slept, ate, and worked together in the same space. And in a strange way, that closeness kept everyone alive. In the corners, benches lined the walls, layered with straw, fur, and woven wool blankets. These were beds by night and seats by day. When the cold grew sharp enough to sting, everyone huddled close, children between parents, the elderly wrapped in thick cloaks. Their blankets were made from sheepskin, reindeer hides, or thick woven wool. Viking women were skilled weavers. They spun cloth so dense it could block out the wind. In the coldest months, they even covered the walls with hanging tapestries, not for decoration, but to hold in the heat. Animals were part of the warmth too. In many homes, sheep, goats, and cows were brought inside during winter nights. They stayed in a separate section of the longhouse a little lower than the main floor, so their body heat rose up. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. A few cows could make the difference between freezing and surviving. The Vikings knew their materials well. The turf walls' thick layers of grass and soil packed between wooden planks worked like natural insulation. They trapped warmth, held back the wind, and absorbed moisture from the air. Even when the outside world froze solid, the inside stayed just above freezing, enough for comfort under fur and wool. And when the wind blew hard enough to shake the door, the people inside didn't fear it. They'd sit by the hearth, tell old Norse tales about Odin and Thor, about giants and spirits, and the long nights of the gods. Children listened wide-eyed, their faces lit by firelight. For them, the storm outside was just part of the story. At night, the fire burned low. Someone would wake every few hours to feed it, stirring the coals carefully so the heat never died. If the flames went out, the house would chill fast. So the fire was treated like a living thing, tended, respected, never ignored. The sound of the wind outside became a kind of rhythm, a reminder of how fragile life was, and how strong their little world had to be. When you're lying under heavy furs, with the warmth of family around you and the soft hum of the fire nearby, you can almost feel what they felt, that quiet gratitude for simply being alive through another night. The longhouse was more than a building. It was a heartbeat in the wilderness. Its walls carried laughter, whispers, and the soft cries of newborns. The rafters held the scent of smoke and bread, the memory of years surviving winters that came and went like waves. And outside, beyond those thick turf walls, the snow never stopped falling. The stars above were hidden behind gray clouds. The wolves howled across frozen fields. But inside, in that fragile bubble of warmth, humanity endured, dreaming, resting, waiting for the sun to return. For the Vikings, home wasn't just where they lived. It was where they defied nature itself. And that defiance, that unyielding strength, is what kept them alive through the coldest nights the north could bring. When the sun vanished early and the world outside turned white and silent, the Vikings turned to their oldest form of survival stories. Long before books or electricity, before clocks or calendars, they marked the passing of time by firelight and words. Every night, as snow drifted past the small roof opening and the wind pressed against the walls, voices rose softly from around the hearth. The longhouse would glow with the steady orange warmth, its shadows dancing along the beams and furs. The air was thick with the smell of burning pine, wood smoke, and animal hides drying above the flames. Somewhere, a pot of stew simmered, sending the faint scent of herbs into the heavy air. Outside was endless dark, a black so deep that even the moon sometimes refused to show itself. Inside, though, the fire was like a heartbeat, and the stories were its breath. Old men told tales of the gods, of Odin, the wise wanderer who gave his eye for knowledge, of Thor, strong and loud, swinging his hammer across the heavens to chase away frost giants. They spoke of Loki too, the trickster, whose mischief often brought chaos, but whose cleverness also saved the gods from ruin. Each story had been told hundreds of times before, but it never grew old. The rhythm, the words, the laughter, and gasps, they warmed the soul as much as the fire warmed the body. Children listened wide-eyed, their faces glowing with reflected firelight. Some clutched their mother's hands. Some buried their faces in furs when the story turned dark, when sea serpents rose from the depths or frost giants crept across the mountains. But even the scariest tales had comfort in them, because they reminded everyone of something bigger than the storm. The world outside might be wild and cruel, but in their stories, it had meaning. Sometimes, between stories, someone would sing. The Vikings loved songs that flowed like waves, deep and slow, echoing through the rafters. The words might praise a hero, mourn a fallen friend, or thank the gods for warmth and food. The voices blended with the crackle of fire and the hum of the wind outside, making a sound that was part music, part memory. And when silence finally fell, it wasn't empty. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that feels full, and the earth itself is listening. There was something deeply spiritual in those nights. To the Vikings, fire was sacred. It wasn't just for cooking or light, it was life. The god Logi was said to be fire itself, fierce and consuming, but also vital. Without him, the world would freeze. So they treated their hearth with reverence. Every family kept its own flame alive through winter, feeding it daily, never letting it go out completely. To lose your fire was like losing a part of your soul. The women tended it carefully, adding wood just enough to keep the embers glowing through the long, cold nights. If a spark caught the straw or the furs, the whole house could burn, so fire was both their greatest friend and their most dangerous guest. And in the dim hours before dawn, when everyone had drifted into sleep, one person would wake, maybe from habit, maybe from the cold, and quietly stir the embers again. The fire would flare up, painting orange light over sleeping faces, warming the room, reminding everyone that they were still here. It's strange to think about now how the Vikings lived in such closeness, their lives pressed together by necessity. But maybe that's why they were such strong people. They shared not just food and warmth, but every breath, every dream, every story. They didn't have much, no pillows, no private rooms, no comfort of silence, but what they had, they shared. And that kind of togetherness could turn even the coldest night into something almost beautiful. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, the faint rhythm of an old Norse lullaby, the soft laughter of tired voices, the sigh of logs shifting in the fire. Outside, snow falls endlessly, but inside, there's peace. These moments of warmth and storytelling were more than just ways to pass the time. They were how people reminded themselves that they mattered, that they belonged, and that even in the deep winter darkness, there was still light, not just from the fire, but from each other. Because in the end, survival wasn't only about fur and firewood, it was about hope. And hope, in a Viking longhouse, sounded like a story whispered under blankets while the blizzard howled beyond the walls. When the wind outside roared like a living thing and frost coated the inside of the longhouse walls, survival came down to one thing: warmth. And for the Vikings, warmth meant layers. You might imagine them wearing armor and helmets all the time, but most of their life wasn't spent fighting, it was spent enduring. So they became masters of clothing themselves for the cold, turning fur and wool into a kind of second skin. Every Viking family had its own system, a balance of practicality and tradition, passed down like an art form. The women, skilled weavers, spun wool so thick and dense that it could resist even the northern wind. They didn't have modern looms or machines, but their hands worked wonders, creating fabric that felt almost alive with heat. A Viking's day started with the base layer, a long tunic of wool or linen, soft but sturdy. Over that came a thicker wool shirt, then sometimes another. The trick was to trap warm air between layers, not just to pile on bulk. They understood this long before science explained it. For their legs, men wore wool trousers and sometimes an extra wrapping of cloth, like early leggings tied tightly around their calves. Women wore long wool dresses with thick undershifts. The fabric reached down to their boots, brushing against the fur or leather that lined the floor. And over it all came their greatest invention, the cloak. The Viking cloak wasn't just clothing, it was a shield against the cold. Made of wool on one side and fur or sheepskin on the other, it could be flipped depending on the weather. Fur in for softness, fur out for snow. Some were pinned at the shoulder with metal brooches, others simply wrapped tight and tied with leather cords. A cloak could mean the difference between freezing and surviving, especially for those who had to step outside into the storm to feed animals, gather firewood, or check the boats near the frozen shore. Inside the longhouse, those cloaks doubled as blankets. Families slept wrapped in them, with children tucked underneath the edges. If the fire burned low during the night, they could pull the cloaks tighter, trapping the warmth from their own breath. And then there were the furs, their secret weapon. Reindeer hide was prized for its warmth, soft and light, but thick with natural insulation. Bear fur, wolf fur, even fox pelts lined sleeping areas and clothing. The Vikings didn't waste a single part of an animal. Skins became bed covers, leather turned into belts or mittens, and sinew was used to stitch it all together. Each piece of fur carried a story of a hunt, of a gift, of survival. To the Vikings, wearing fur wasn't just about staying warm. It was about respect for the world that sustained them. Every pelt represented a life taken and a life preserved in return. Even their footwear was a marvel of simplicity and function. Shoes were made from leather, shaped and stitched by hand, often filled with straw or dry grass to act as insulation. When snow soaked through, they'd replace the grass and hang the shoes near the fire to dry. Crude, maybe, but it worked. The same went for their mittens, made of felted wool or fur, and for hats, round, close-fitting caps that covered the ears. Sometimes, they even wrapped scarves around their faces, leaving only the eyes exposed when venturing out into storms that could blind a man in seconds. And yet, what's most amazing is how they balanced comfort and endurance. They didn't bundle themselves to the point of immobility. They knew that moving kept the blood flowing, that breath and heat were as important as any garment. Children learned this early, to keep the hands near the body, to breathe into their cloaks when the air turned to ice, to never sit still too long unless you were by the fire. In the flickering glow of the hearth, you could see their clothing glint, the sheen of fur, the deep brown of tan leather, the dull silver of brooches catching the light. It wasn't fancy, but it was beautiful in its own rugged way, beauty born from necessity. At night, when the house grew quiet and the world outside went white, they layered every scrap of fabric they owned onto their sleeping places. Blankets, cloaks, pelts, and even spare tunics. The smell of wool and smoke filled the air, and under those layers, families breathed together, slow, steady, and safe. Their warmth came from the materials they made, yes, but also from the understanding that they were part of something larger: nature, family, fire, all intertwined. Sometimes, a storm would rage for days, trapping them inside. They'd wake to find the doorway half buried in snow, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. But still, they endured, laughing softly, sharing warmth, tending the embers, pulling their cloaks a little tighter. In that frozen world, the Vikings didn't just fight the cold, they embraced it. They understood it. They dressed not to conquer winter, but to live with it, like an old companion they'd known all their lives. And when the wind howled at the walls, they'd pull their cloaks around their shoulders and whisper to each other, "Let it blow," because deep inside the longhouse, wrapped in layers of wool, fur, and love, the storm could not reach them. When night fell on the Viking world, it fell completely. No hum of cities, no glow from streetlights, not even the faint shine of candles behind glass. Just the deep, soft dark of the northern winter. Inside the longhouse, families settled together, preparing for sleep the way their ancestors had for generations. In our world, we think of sleeping as something private: one bed, one person, maybe two. But for the Vikings, privacy didn't exist the way it does now. Life was shared, space was shared, and warmth was shared most of all. As the fire dimmed to a long stretch of glowing coals, families arranged themselves across benches lined with straw, fur, and wool. Parents lay closest to the fire pit, where the air stayed warmest. Children curled against them, tucked into the crooks of arms or hidden beneath cloaks that smelled faintly of smoke and pine. The old and the sick lay further back, where the air was cooler but still bearable. Sometimes even a guest or a servant joined in, because in the dead of winter, warmth wasn't a luxury. It was something you gave freely. The animals had their own corner too, separated by a low wooden barrier. Cows, goats, and sheep slept there, their breath rising in gentle clouds. Their warmth lifted into the room like invisible smoke, blending with the heat from the hearth. When the wind howled outside, the sound of soft animal breathing was strangely comforting. To a Viking child, this was normal: to fall asleep listening to the crackle of wood, the murmur of voices, and the slow, steady rhythm of the animals nearby. It was a chorus of survival, soft and steady, like the heartbeat of the house itself. The floor was covered with layers of straw or moss, changed often to stay clean. Over that came thick blankets of fur and wool, the same hides they wore by day, now spread out for the night. Everyone added their cloaks, spare tunics, or animal skins to the pile. The goal wasn't comfort the way we think of it now. It was warmth, pure and simple. Still, there was comfort here in the closeness, in the shared breath. Body heat was the most reliable tool against the cold, and the Vikings knew it instinctively. When one person stirred, another might shift closer without a word. A child might reach for a parent's hand, or a husband might adjust a fur over his wife's shoulder. These small movements, almost invisible, kept the group alive. The air inside the longhouse was thick with scent, smoke, wool, pine, and the faint sweetness of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Every now and then, a log in the fire would pop, sending sparks upward like little golden stars. The smoke found its way toward the roof's narrow vent, drifting slowly through the dark. Outside, the world was frozen still. The snow muffled all sound, turning the landscape into a soft, silent sea of white. The cold pressed against the wooden walls, trying to find a way in, but it couldn't. Not against the heat of dozens of human hearts, sleeping close together, breathing in rhythm. It's easy to imagine that moment, lying among them. The faint warmth against your cheeks, the heavy weight of furs on your body, the low hum of wind against the roof. You wouldn't see much, just the faint red glow of coals and the outlines of shapes beside you, but you'd feel it all. The stillness, the unity, the safety. In those quiet hours, the Vikings dreamed of many things: of sailing again when the ice melted, of green fields and golden harvests, of gods who walked among men. But mostly, they dreamed of surviving, of waking up to another dawn, because each morning was a victory. When the first pale light filtered through the cracks in the wall, families stirred slowly. Someone would add wood to the fire, coaxing it back into flame. Children would stretch beneath the furs, their hair smelling of smoke. The animals would rise and shake the frost from their backs. And for a moment, before the day began, there was peace. The kind that only comes from having made it through the night together. There's something beautiful in that simplicity. The Vikings didn't need comfort in the way we crave it today. Their beds weren't soft, their blankets weren't clean by modern standards, and the air was always tinged with smoke. But they slept soundly, not just in fur and wool, but in belonging. To them, the longhouse wasn't just a shelter, it was a shared heartbeat. And maybe that's what we've forgotten, that warmth isn't only a temperature, it's a feeling. The Vikings knew it. They lived it. They slept through the darkest winters in the world, because they faced them together. So as you imagine them now, sleeping under the dim orange glow of the hearth, let yourself feel that quiet, that ancient, primal peace. Because somewhere deep in your own heartbeat, that same instinct to share warmth, to endure together, still lives. If warmth was life in the Viking winter, food was its heartbeat. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was constant. It crept into every corner of the longhouse, slowed every movement, and tested every body. To survive it, the Vikings didn't just eat for pleasure, they ate to endure. Every meal was a small victory over the frost. Long before the snow fell, families prepared. Summer and autumn weren't seasons for resting, they were seasons for gathering, hunting, drying, and storing. Because when the rivers froze and the fields disappeared under ice, there would be no crops, no fresh milk, no hunting trips from home. Everything they ate in winter came from what they'd managed to save. Imagine the longhouse again. Near the roof beams, bundles of herbs hang upside down, their scent faint but pleasant. Thyme, dill, maybe wild garlic. Along the walls, smoked fish and slabs of meat dangle from hooks, darkened by weeks of smoke. Barrels sit in the corners, filled with dried grains, salted pork, or pickled vegetables sealed with wax. The air inside always carried a hint of that smoky, meaty perfume, comforting and heavy, a promise that no one would starve tonight. Meals were simple, but they were made with care. In the center of the longhouse, the fire pit served not only as a source of heat, but as a kitchen. Over it hung a great iron pot that never truly went cold. Inside, something was always simmering: stew, porridge, or broth thickened with barley or oats and flavored with bits of dried fish, root vegetables, or whatever herbs survived the season. The taste changed depending on what they had, but the rhythm of it stayed the same. A spoonful of warmth after a day of cold. Sometimes, they'd boil bones to make a rich broth, extracting every last bit of nourishment. Fat was precious not just for cooking, but for energy. They used animal fat to fry, to coat dried foods, even to seal containers against air. And though it was winter, they still had a touch of sweetness. Honey was their treasure. It flavored drinks, soothed throats, and sweetened the rare treat of baked bread. Some families brewed honey into mead, a golden drink that glowed in the firelight. A sip of mead on a frozen night wasn't tea just comfort, it was a reminder of summer, bottled sunlight in a world of white. There was a rhythm to their evenings around the fire. The family gathered, bowls in hand, steam rising from the stew. The firelight made every surface shimmer, the wooden spoons, the woolen sleeves, the glint of metal jewelry at someone's throat. Children dipped their bread into the pot, laughing quietly. The older ones shared stories between bites. No one wasted food. Not a scrap. Not a bone. Everything had a use. Even bones were cracked open for the marrow inside. The remains might go to the animals or be burned for grease. To us, their meals might seem plain, but to them, each one was a reassurance that their planning had worked, that their world, even under ice and wind, still gave enough to live. And when storms trapped them indoors for days, that food became their anchor. The pot would be refilled again and again, each time with a little less of this or that, but still nourishing. You could tell how long the winter had lasted by how thin the stew became, but even the thinnest broth, shared around the fire, carried hope. Sometimes, someone would roast a little bit of dried meat over the flame, and the smell alone was enough to lift everyone's mood. The children would sit close, hands outstretched, eyes wide, waiting for their turn. And always, there was gratitude, not the kind you speak out loud, but the quiet kind, shared in glances and small smiles. Gratitude for the animals that fed them, for the fire that kept burning, for the hands that cooked. In a way, their mealtimes were sacred. The Vikings didn't separate survival from spirit. Every meal was an offering to life, to each other, and sometimes to the gods. Before eating, someone might drop a small piece of food into the fire, a gift to the unseen forces that watched over them. Food wasn't just fuel, it was memory. It carried the taste of summer, the work of harvest, the stories of the sea. A dried fish wasn't just a meal, it was a memory of the catch that had once filled their boats. A loaf of bread wasn't just nourishment, it was the harvest of a field that now slept under snow. And so, as the wind howled and the longhouse walls creaked, the Vikings ate together, not just to fill their stomachs, but to keep their spirits alive. They didn't have plenty, but what they had, they made last. Through salt, smoke, and sheer will, they turned scarcity into strength. If you sat with them now, in that smoky room with the storm raging outside, you'd taste more than food. You'd taste endurance. You'd taste community. And in that moment, the cold wouldn't seem so frightening after all. The first sign of the storm wasn't snow, it was silence. The Vikings knew that sound was the heartbeat of their world, the whisper of the trees, the creak of wood, the sigh of the sea. When those sounds disappeared, replaced by a heavy stillness, they knew what was coming. A storm was never just wind and ice to them. It was a presence unpredictable, alive, and to be respected. The night before a blizzard always had its own kind of tension. The air felt strange, sharper, and even the animals grew restless. A dog would pace near the door, whining softly. The cows would shift in their stalls, their warm breath fogging the air. The men checked the roof beams, tightened the ropes that held the wall steady, and brought extra firewood inside. Then, the wind came. At first, it was only a low hum like someone exhaling far away. Then it rose, grew teeth, and howled against the walls. The snow began to fall in fine, sharp flakes that glittered in the firelight whenever the door opened. In minutes, the world outside vanished behind a white curtain. Inside the longhouse, the storm sounded like a giant beast clawing to get in. The wooden beams creaked and groaned. Loose thatch flapped wildly at the roof's edge. Smoke from the hearth shifted and danced as the wind pressed down from above. The family huddled closer around the fire. The flames seemed to shrink with every gust, as if afraid. Someone fed it more wood, and the smell of pine filled the room, sweet and sharp. The fire roared back to life, defiant. Outside, the snow piled higher and higher, blanketing everything. The paths they had walked that morning were gone. The fences around the animal pens vanished. The sound of the sea, usually ever present in the distance, was swallowed by the blizzard's roar. For the Vikings, storms like this were not rare, but they were always dangerous. A single mistake could mean death. Going outside, even for a moment, was a gamble. The cold wasn't like the cold most of us know. It could cut through layers of wool and fur in seconds, freezing the skin beneath. And yet, there was work to do. Someone had to check the animals, make sure the firewood piles hadn't collapsed. So, wrapped in cloaks and furs, a man would step outside just for a minute, he'd say, and vanish into the white. Inside, the others waited, counting the seconds, listening for the door. The sound of the storm filled every breath. When he returned, shaking snow from his shoulders and stamping his boots, everyone exhaled in relief. Then came the long wait. A Viking blizzard could last for hours or 4 days. No one really knew. The family would ration firewood, eat sparingly, and rest when they could. The air grew thick with heat and smoke, and the walls dripped with condensation that froze again by morning. Children whispered stories to each other, tales of frost giants and snow spirits, of Odin riding across the sky in his chariot. The older ones nodded, pretending not to listen, though their eyes flicked toward the door every time the wind screamed. Sometimes, they'd hear things in the storm, voices that weren't there. A call, a cry, or the faint sound of something moving beyond the walls. The Vikings didn't think of storms as empty. They believed the wind carried souls, spirits, and the whispers of the gods. That made it terrifying, yes, but also sacred. To sleep during a storm was an act of trust. Trust in the walls, trust in the fire, trust in each other. Wrapped in furs, they drifted in and out of slumber, lulled by the rhythm of the wind, fierce, then fading, then fierce again. Every so often, someone would rise to stoke the fire. They'd move quietly, careful not to wake the others. The crackle of wood was a comfort, a heartbeat in the dark. Sometimes, they'd whisper a small prayer to Thor, perhaps, to hold the roof steady, or to Frigg, goddess of home and hearth, to keep the fire alive. And when morning finally came, it wasn't bright. The storm didn't stop all at once. It slowed, softened, and began to breathe again. The wind's growl turned into a sigh, the snow into silence. The world outside lay buried beneath a new layer of white, smooth and untouched. The door had to be pushed open with effort. Light spilled in, pale and cold, but beautiful. Every surface glittered like crushed glass. Trees bent under the weight of ice. The air smelled sharp and pure. The family stepped out together, blinking at the brightness. Their footprints were the first marks in the new snow. The animals stirred, steam rising from their nostrils. The longhouse stood proud, its walls crusted with frost, but unbroken. They had survived. And for the Vikings, that was everything. Every storm they endured made them stronger, closer, more certain that they belonged to the land, and it belonged to them. Inside, the fire still glowed. The house smelled of smoke and stew, and the warmth clung to their clothes. The blizzard was gone, but its memory would stay a story told beside the hearth for many winters to come. For in the Viking world, surviving the storm wasn't just survival, it was proof that they could face the wild itself and win. If you asked a Viking what the heart of their home was, they wouldn't point to a door, a wall, or even a roof. They'd point to the fire. The hearth wasn't just where they cooked or warmed themselves. It was where life began each morning and where it settled each night. It was their light, their safety, their spirit, the glowing heart of every longhouse, pulsing with orange and gold. Picture it now, a low, open pit in the center of the room, lined with stone and filled with glowing coals. Smoke rose lazily upward toward a narrow hole in the roof, the smoke hole, and drifted out into the dark, carrying the scent of wood, meat, and life itself. Around it, families gathered in a loose circle, just as countless generations before them had done. There were no matches or lighters in those days. Keeping the fire alive was a serious task. If the flame died, the house grew cold fast, and rekindling it from nothing was no small feat. So they tended it carefully, feeding it through the night, covering it with ash before sleep to preserve the embers, and breathing it back to life each morning. In many ways, the fire was a member of the family, one that had to be fed, cared for, and never ignored. Its flicker cast shadows on the walls, turning the longhouse into a world of moving shapes and soft light. Sometimes, if the wind outside shifted, the flames would dance wildly, throwing sparks into the air like tiny stars. The Vikings respected fire deeply. It was both kind and cruel, giver of warmth, destroyer of homes. They believed it carried a divine essence, a presence that demanded reverence. Some even whispered that the goddess Logi, the embodiment of fire itself, lived in every flame, watching silently as families huddled around her light. In the dark months of winter, when the sun barely rose and the world outside lay buried in snow, the hearth became the only sun they had. Children would play near it, tracing shapes in the ash while their parents mended tools or carved wood. The warmth made people drowsy, and often, someone would fall asleep sitting upright, lulled by the crackling of the logs. It was also where stories lived. Every evening, as the day faded, voices would rise around the fire. The elders told tales of gods and monsters, of seas crossed and battles fought. Some stories warned of frost giants that wandered in blizzards. Others spoke of Odin and Thor, watching from the skies. Each tale shimmered in the firelight, the words almost tangible, glowing and fading like sparks. The children listened wide-eyed, half believing that if they looked too long into the flames, they might see the gods themselves. The fire brought comfort, but it also bound everyone together. The circle around the hearth was a circle of trust. Within that light, they shared everything: food, laughter, secrets, even grief. When someone died, the fire burned for them. When a child was born, it was the fire that warmed their first breath. Sometimes, when the storms grew fierce and the walls groaned, the family would sit in silence, just watching the fire. The flames seemed to hum softly, almost like a lullaby. It reminded them that even in darkness, something still burned, small, steady, and alive. The hearth also connected them to their ancestors. They believed that when they lit a fire, it awakened the spirits of those who came before. Their warmth, their wisdom, their courage, all of it flickered in that same light. Every spark was a memory, every ember a heartbeat from the past. And in the rhythm of that fire, the hiss of sap, the crack of wood, the low, gentle roar, there was peace. A peace that came from knowing that no matter how long the winter lasted, as long as the fire lived, they would too. Even the chores that surrounded it became rituals. Stirring the pot, adding herbs, turning a log, sweeping the ash, each act was done with quiet care. There was no hurry, no rush, just the slow, deliberate rhythm of people who knew how to live with the land, not against it. At night, when the house finally grew quiet, someone would always stay awake a little longer. One last guardian of the flame. They'd pull the fur tighter around their shoulders, stare into the glowing embers, and lose themselves in thought. Maybe they'd think of the day just past, or the spring that felt so far away. Or maybe they'd simply listen to the fire, to the sleeping breaths around them, to the wind whispering against the walls. In that moment, the line between human and nature blurred. The fire wasn't just theirs. It was part of something older, something shared by every living thing that ever sought warmth in the dark. So when the Vikings said goodnight, they didn't just lie down and sleep. They trusted the fire to watch over them, a silent guardian, flickering softly in the endless northern night. The hearth wasn't just in their homes, it was in their hearts, and in that glow, gentle, ancient, eternal, they found the strength to dream. When winter ruled the land, most people stayed inside. But Vikings were not most people. Even in the deepest cold, when the sea turned to glass and the ground to stone, some of them still had to travel. Maybe they were traders, carrying goods between villages. Maybe they were messengers with news too important to wait for spring. Or maybe they were hunters, chasing food for their families. Whatever the reason, there came a time when even the fiercest storms couldn't keep them still. To step outside during a Norse winter was to step into another world. The air itself felt sharp, like it could cut your lungs. The snow was not soft and gentle, it was hard, compacted by wind into uneven ridges that creaked beneath their boots. The light was dim, the sun hanging low and pale, giving everything a strange blue glow. The Vikings dressed for survival, not comfort. They wore layers of wool and fur, linen undergarments, thick cloaks, and boots stuffed with straw or animal hair to trap heat. Over their faces, they sometimes wrapped cloth or fur, leaving only their eyes visible, eyes that watered and burned from the cold wind. Travel was slow. Every step had to be measured. Paths that were clear in summer vanished under snow, replaced by white emptiness. Without landmarks, they had to rely on instinct, on the shape of distant hills, on the direction of the wind, or on stars when the sky allowed. Sometimes they moved in small groups, taking turns breaking the trail through snow that reached their knees. The one in front would push forward until exhausted, then step aside while the next took over. It was a quiet rhythm. Crunch, breathe, switch, and in that rhythm, they found strength. When they crossed frozen rivers, every sound mattered. A small crack beneath their boots could make the heart stop. They knew the difference between the safe deep groan of thick ice and the thin, sharp whisper of danger. Sometimes they'd crawl, spreading their weight to stay above the freezing water below. The cold was merciless. If the ice gave way, there was no second chance. And yet, they did it. Again and again. Because for the Vikings, the world was never something to escape, it was something to face. At night, they made camp in hollows shielded from the wind. They'd dig into the snow, lay down spruce branches or animal hides, and build a small fire, careful not to melt too much ice beneath it. Around that fragile circle of warmth, they'd huddle together, sharing dried meat or fish, passing around a small flask of mead if they were lucky. The fire cracked, sparks flying into the night, and for a moment, it felt like the whole world had shrunk. Just the glow of flame, the breath of their companions, and the whisper of the wind. Some nights, they could hear wolves in the distance, a sound that was both haunting and oddly comforting. It reminded them they were not alone in this frozen wilderness. The animals endured the same cold, the same hunger. Sleep came in fragments. They wrapped themselves in furs, boots still on, weapons close at hand. The stars above were sharp and countless. The Milky Way stretched like frost across the heavens, and the aurora, the northern lights, shimmered green and gold across the black sky. Many Vikings believed it was the reflection of Valkyrie's armor as they rode to collect fallen warriors. Watching it, you could almost believe the same. When morning came, the world looked and changed, endless white, endless cold. But they rose, brushed the frost from their beards, and moved on. The trail ahead was long, but every step forward was a triumph. Sometimes, a blizzard would strike without warning. One moment, the air would be calm. The next, it would explode into chaos. Snow whipped sideways, wind howled like a beast, and the path vanished instantly. In those moments, survival depended on instinct. They'd huddle together, turn their backs to the wind, and waited out minutes feeling like hours, hours feeling like forever. When it finally passed, silence returned, heavy and deep. The snow would settle again, smooth and unbroken, erasing all traces of their struggle. It was as if the storm had swallowed their footprints and moved on. Traveling in such conditions wasn't just a test of endurance, it was a kind of meditation. The Vikings knew that out here, pride meant nothing. The cold didn't care how strong you were, or how brave. You had to respect it, listen to it, move with it, not against it. And in that respect came a strange peace. Because in the stillness between the gusts, in the vast silence of the frozen land, there was beauty, the kind that only reveals itself to those who survive it. The glitter of ice on branches, the soft glow of dawn spreading across snow, the faint warmth of the sun returning after a long, dark night. Every journey was a reminder. Life endured, even here. The fire still burned, the heart still beat. The path, though frozen, still led forward. When they finally reached a village or homestead, the first sight of smoke curling from a chimney must have felt like a miracle. The door opening, the rush of warm air, the sound of voices, all of it washing away the memory of the wind. Inside, they would sit by the fire, thawing slowly, their faces red from the cold, their hands trembling as feeling returned. And as they shared stories of the road, someone would always say the same thing: "We made it." Not as a boast, but as gratitude. Because every winter journey was a battle against a silent enemy, and every safe return was a victory worth remembering. In the Viking world, survival was never just about people. It was about every creature that shared the land, from the smallest birds to the mighty wolves that prowled the snow. The North was not kind, and the Vikings knew that to live through its winters, they needed to respect the balance of life around them. Their bond with animals wasn't simple ownership. It was cooperation. Every animal had a role, a purpose, and a place in their story. Some gave warmth, some gave food, and some gave warning. To the Vikings, each one was part of the same great rhythm of survival, and in winter, that rhythm was tested most of all. Let's start with the animals closest to them, their dogs. Viking dogs were not pets in the way we think of them today. They were guardians, hunters, and friends. They were bred to be strong, with thick fur and sharp instincts, able to run through snow and track scents that humans couldn't. At night, they slept near the longhouse walls, ears twitching, always alert. Their presence gave comfort, not just for safety, but for warmth. It said that when the wind howled hardest, a Viking might rest with a dog curled at their feet, sharing body heat through the long, dark night. Then there were the livestock, the quiet heart of Viking survival. Cows, goats, and sheep weren't just food. They were life itself. During the winter, they were kept in byres, small, warm stables built close to, or even attached to the longhouse. The body heat of these animals helped keep the air inside the home warmer. In turn, the family cared for them tenderly, brushing frost from their coats and feeding them from stores of dried hay and grain. In the stillness of the frozen months, those animals were a kind of comfort. The low sounds they made, the soft mooing of cows, the rustle of straw, the sighs of tired creatures gave life to the silence of winter. To the Vikings, these were not just beasts of burden, but companions on the long road of survival. But beyond the walls of the longhouse, the animals of the wild told their own stories. The Vikings were careful observers of nature. They knew when the wolves were close, when the ravens flew higher than usual, when the deer began to move toward lower ground. Each sign meant something. A sudden quiet in the forest meant a predator nearby. A trail of fresh tracks in the snow meant food could still be found. And though wolves were feared, they were also respected. The Vikings saw them as reflections of their own spirit, fierce, loyal, bound by family. They told stories of Fenrir, the great wolf of Norse myth, destined to bring about the end of the world. But even in that myth, the wolf was not just a monster. It was power itself, wild and untamed. There were also ravens, Odin's birds, Hugin and Munin, who flew across the world to bring him knowledge. The Vikings watched real ravens closely, for they were scavengers that led hunters to carcasses buried in snow. A raven circling overhead could mean a fresh kill nearby, a chance at food when times were desperate. Even the reindeer and elk had lessons to teach. The Vikings admired their ability to move gracefully across ice and snow, to find sustenance where humans saw only emptiness. Their tracks became guides for travelers lost in the wild. Their hides, when hunted, became clothing, boots, or blankets that kept people alive when the temperature dropped far below freezing. In every part of Viking life, animals weren't just background, they were teachers. Watching them, people learned how to survive, how to move quietly, how to rest when the weather turned, how to endure without complaint. There's an Old Norse belief that the world itself, the great tree Yggdrasil, was filled with animals, each one playing a part in the universe's balance. An eagle sat at its top, a dragon gnawed at its roots, and a squirrel ran endlessly between them, carrying messages. To the Vikings, animals weren't below them, they were equals in the great story of life. So when they hunted, it wasn't done with arrogance. It was done with thanks. A successful hunt was followed by small offerings, a few drops of mead, a whispered prayer to the land spirits. Every life taken meant another life spared. It was a cycle, not a conquest. The connection between humans and animals went even deeper in their myths. Berserkers, the legendary Viking warriors, were said to channel the spirits of bears or wolves when they fought. They believed that by taking on the animal's strength and fury, they became unstoppable. Whether or not it was true, the idea itself said something important, that the line between man and beast wasn't a wall, but a bridge. And in winter, that bridge was everything. Because while the winds roared and the snow fell endlessly, The Vikings never saw themselves as separate from the animals outside their walls. They were all facing the same struggle, the same hunger, the same cold, the same need for shelter and fire. In that shared endurance, there was a kind of quiet unity. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the storm was at its worst, a Viking might hear a wolf howl in the distance. Instead of fear, they might feel something else understanding. That sound wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. Out there in the same freezing dark, life went on. And maybe that was the greatest wisdom of the North, that no one survived alone. Not people, not animals, not even gods. Everything depended on everything else. So when morning came, and the sky turned pale again, the Vikings would step outside, see fresh tracks in the snow and smile, proof that life had passed through the night once more. For most of the long, cold months, the Vikings lived quietly. The days blurred together, waking by firelight, working by twilight, sleeping under thick furs while the wind sang against the roof. But every now and then, something special broke the silence: of feast, a gathering, a reminder that even in the frozen north, life could still be full of warmth. They called it the Great Midwinter Celebration that later became known as Yule. It was more than just a party. It was a promise that the sun would return, that the earth would warm again, and that even the longest night would end. When arrived, the air inside the longhouse changed. The fire burned brighter. The smell of roasting meat filled the air. Laughter, rare and precious during winter, echoed from one end of the hall to the other. It wasn't tea about luxury, most had little to spare, but about sharing what they had. Families would bring out the food they'd been saving for weeks: smoked fish, dried meat, a bit of cheese, and sometimes a cask of mead or ale. The feast wasn't just a meal, it was a survival ritual in itself. To eat together meant to stay connected, to remind one another that they weren't alone against the cold. In those moments, the longhouse transformed. Shadows danced on the walls, faces glowed red from the fire, and the sound of voices rose like a song. Old stories were told again, sagas of gods, warriors, and the endless struggle between ice and fire. Children listened wide-eyed as their elders spoke of Thor battling frost giants, or of Frey bringing the first warmth of spring. Sometimes, someone would take up a drum or a small harp, and the room would fill with rhythm. The music wasn't loud or fancy, it was simple, raw, and steady, like the heartbeat of the North itself. There were games, too, contests of strength or riddles, little challenges to stir laughter. And when the mead flowed freely, the songs grew bolder. The men's voices rumbled deep, while the women's laughter sparkled like frost in the air. Yet even as the feast went on, there was always a touch of something else, a quiet awareness of the world outside. The Vikings believed that during the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. Spirits might wander, ancestors might draw close. So after the laughter faded, they'd leave a bit of food by the door or the hearth, offerings for those unseen guests. The firelight flickered over bowls of stew and scraps of bread, the gifts set gently aside. It was a small act of kindness, a way to honor the past and keep peace with the shadows of winter. And when the last cup was emptied, and the fire burned low, silence returned. The kind of deep, peaceful silence that comes only after warmth and joy have filled the air. Outside, snow fell softly. Inside, the embers glowed. The people lay side by side, wrapped in furs, still smiling in their sleep. But was more than just one night. It could last for days, even weeks. During that time, people didn't work as much. They rested, they repaired their tools, they mended their clothes. The world itself seemed to pause, waiting for the light to return. There's something beautiful in that, isn't there? They lived so close to the edge, food stores dwindling, frost creeping under the doors, and yet, they still chose to celebrate, to dance, to sing, to laugh, even when the cold pressed hard against the walls. It wasn't defiance, it was faith. Faith that spring would come again, that warmth would find its way back to the world. In the dark hours, when the wind howled outside, the flicker of the fire seemed almost magical. The smell of pine logs and mead, the soft murmur of voices, the steady breathing of loved ones asleep, it was enough to make a Viking feel that maybe the gods were smiling on them after all. Some said Odin himself rode through the skies during JL, leading the wild hunt, a ghostly procession of spirits galloping through the storm clouds. The howling wind was their call, and those who heard it stayed close to the fire, whispering prayers for protection. But even that legend carried comfort. Because if Odin was out there, it meant the world was still alive, the gods still watching, the fire still burning, the story still continuing. And so the feasts went on, year after year. Through every winter, through every hardship, JL returned like an old friend. It was the heartbeat of the cold season, the moment when people remembered who they were, strong, enduring, bound together by warmth and hope. When morning came, the longhouse was quiet again. The fire was just glowing coals, and the smell of smoke hung gently in the air. Someone stirred the ashes, adding a log, whispering a few words to the flame. The night was over, but the memory of the feast of laughter and light in the deepest dark lingered, like warmth that refused to fade. When night fell in the Viking world, it wasn't just dark, it was absolute. The kind of darkness that swallows even the outline of the mountains, that hides the stars behind clouds thick with snow. The only light came from the fire, flickering, breathing, alive, painting the longhouse walls with orange shadows. Inside, everyone slept close together. The air was warm from the fire and the bodies packed beneath layers of fur. Children dreamed, the old murmured softly in their sleep, and the house creaked gently as the wind pressed against its walls. But not everyone slept. Each night, one person stayed awake, a silent watcher. It was a duty taken seriously, passed from one to another as the night stretched endlessly through the winter. The watcher sat near the hearth, tending the fire, listening for the sounds that didn't belong. It wasn't just about keeping the flame alive, though that was important. If the fire went out, the cold would creep in fast, biting at fingers and toes, waking everyone to shivers and fear. The fire was the heart of the house, and the watcher was its guardian. Outside, the wind moaned through the cracks of the roof. Sometimes it sounded almost human, like voices calling from far away. The watcher knew better than to listen too closely. The old story said that the spirits of the cold tried to trick people into opening the door, to let the warmth escape. So the watcher kept still, on the fire, ears alert, but heart steady. Every now and then, the dogs outside would stir. A low growl, a shuffle of movement, maybe a fox passing by, or a deer pushing through the snow, maybe something else. The watcher would stand, lift a small oil lamp, and move quietly to the door. The world outside was silent. No light, no motion, just the deep breath of winter. Frost glittered faintly on the doorway. The dog's eyes glowed dim in the dark, watching him back. They understood the night better than humans ever could. He'd whisper a few calming words to them, scratch behind one's ear, then return inside. The fire popped suddenly, a spark leaping into the air. The sound made the watcher smile. It meant the wood was dry, burning well. He leaned closer, stirring the embers with the small iron rod, feeding it a new log, watching the flames climb higher. Time passed differently in the quiet. Minutes stretched like hours. The watcher's thoughts wandered to the sea, to summer, to green fields and warm sunlight, to friends lost to storms, to children who'd grown strong. The silence of winter was not empty, it was full of memory. Sometimes, the watcher would hear faint sounds in the distance, the groan of ice on the river, the crash of snow falling from a tree, the distant howl of a wolf. Each sound carried weight. The land was never truly still. Even frozen, it moved, shifted, breathed. There was comfort in that. And then, when he least expected it, a soft glow might appear outside. The northern lights, green and gold ribbons swirling across the night sky, painting the snow in ghostly colors. The watcher would step out just for a moment, his breath rising in clouds, and look up. It was said that the lights were the armor of Valkyries, or the spirits of ancestors dancing in the heavens. Whatever they were, they reminded him that the world was vast, and that even in this endless cold, beauty still found a way to shine. He'd stay there for a while, the frost biting at his beard, the silence humming like music. Then he'd go back in, closing the door gently, bringing the chill with him. The fire welcomed him with a soft crackle. By then, the stars would have shifted, proof that time was still moving, even when it felt frozen. The watcher would glance over the sleepers, the small shapes of children, the steady rise and fall of his wife's chest, the dog curled by the door. He'd sit back down, pull the fur around his shoulders, and let the warmth sink into his bones. The fire's glow reflected in his eyes, bright and steady. Some watchers prayed quietly to the gods during those hours, a simple whisper to Thor for strength, or to Frigg for protection of the home. Others just sat in silence, trusting the fire and their own patience. And when the first faint light of dawn crept in a pale blue shimmer through the smoke hole, the watcher would sigh, relieved. The night was over. Another battle with the cold won. He'd stir the fire one last time, watching the sparks rise like stars. Soon, the house would wake, children rubbing their eyes, someone stirring a pot of porridge, the sound of life returning. No one ever said much about the watcher's job. It wasn't glorious or heroic. It was quiet work. But everyone knew without that silent vigil, without that one pair of steady eyes through the night, they might not see the morning. In a world that often demanded strength and violence, the silent watch was a different kind of courage, the patience to endure, to guard, to keep the flame alive. And when he finally lay down to rest, the fire still glowing beside him, sleep came easily. Because in that moment, surrounded by warmth and safety, he knew he had done something simple, but sacred. He had kept the darkness outside. The storms never announced themselves politely. They didn't knock. They didn't warn. They simply arrived. A Viking winter storm could begin with nothing more than a strange quiet. The wind would stop. The dogs would lift their heads. The air would feel heavy, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Experienced eyes knew that silence was dangerous. It meant the storm was close. Inside the longhouse, people moved a little faster. Someone checked the roof beams. Someone else pulled extra firewood closer to the hearth. The doors were reinforced with wooden bars, and thick hides were pushed into every crack where cold air might creep in. When the storm finally struck, it came with violence. Wind slammed against the walls like a living thing. Snow flew sideways, hissing as it hit the wood. The roof groaned under the weight, and the whole house seemed to shudder with every gust. Outside, the world disappeared. No land, no sky, only white chaos. Inside, the fire became everything. Flames were fed constantly, logs pushed deep into the embers. The heat had to fight not just the cold, but fear. Children were pulled closer. Animals were brought inside when possible, their warmth adding to the fragile balance, keeping the cold away. The sound of the storm was overwhelming. It screamed through the cracks, howled down the smoke hole, and rattled tools hanging on the walls. It was easy to imagine giants or angry spirits riding the wind, trying to tear the house apart. People spoke quietly during storms, not because they were told to, but because something inside them knew to be respectful. The storm was stronger than any person. All they could do was endure. Snow piled against the door, inch by inch, sealing the house like a tomb. If the storm lasted long enough, someone would have to dig their way out later. For now, they stayed still. The watcher remained awake, eyes fixed on the fire, listening to every change in the sound of the wind. If the roof shifted too much, someone might have to climb up even in the storm to clear snow before it collapsed. It was dangerous, but collapse was worse. Sometimes the storm lasted hours, sometimes days. Food was rationed carefully. Water melted slowly from snow near the fire. Everyone conserved energy, knowing that exhaustion could be deadly if the cold crept in. During the worst moments, when the wind screamed so loudly it felt like the world was ending, people told stories, not loudly, not dramatically, but softly. Familiar tales, comforting ones. Stories that reminded them this had happened before, and people had survived. They spoke of ancestors who endured colder winters, of gods who battled chaos and returned victorious, of summers so warm you could sleep outside without furs. Even if those memories felt far away, they mattered. Children were told to close their eyes and imagine the sea in summer. The sound of waves instead of wind. The smell of salt instead of smoke. It helped. When night came, it was impossible to tell. Darkness and storm blended together. Time lost its meaning. Only the fire marked the passing of hours. As logs turned to embers and embers to ash, Sometimes, the storm tested the house brutally. A beam cracked. Snow burst through a weak spot. Panic flared, but only for a moment. Hands moved quickly. Furs were shoved into gaps. Wood was braced. The house held. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the storm eased. The wind softened. The howling faded to a whisper. Snow stopped hissing against the walls. Silence returned deep and heavy, but no longer threatening. No one rushed outside. That was a mistake learned the hard way. Storms often pretended to end, only to return stronger. So they waited. When the door was finally opened, daylight poured in, blinding and cold. Snow stood higher than the knees, sometimes higher than the waist. The world had been reshaped overnight. Trees bent low under the weight. Paths vanished. Fences were buried. But the longhouse still stood. That was victory. People moved slowly, stiff from cold and tension. They cleared the door, dug paths, checked animals. Losses were counted quietly. Not every storm spared everyone, but survival itself was something to be grateful for. That night, the fire burned a little brighter. Food tasted better. Sleep came deeper, because surviving a storm like that wasn't just about strength. It was about preparation, patience, and staying together when the world outside tried to tear everything apart. The Vikings didn't defeat winter. They endured it. And in that endurance, they found a kind of quiet power, one that carried them through the darkest nights and into the promise of another day. Morning after a great storm never felt like a true morning. The light was pale, almost colorless, reflecting off endless snow. The world looked new, but also unfamiliar, as if everything had been erased and redrawn overnight. The Vikings stepped outside slowly, boots sinking deep with every step. Snow reached their knees, sometimes higher. The air was painfully cold, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Breaths came out in thick white clouds, hanging for a moment before disappearing. The first task was always the same: dig. Wooden shovels scraped against packed snow. Hands numbed quickly, even through gloves made of fur and leather. Work had to be done in short bursts. Too long outside, and fingers lost feeling. Too careless, and frostbite could take hold before anyone noticed. Paths were cleared first, narrow tunnels from the door to the animal pens, to the firewood stack, to the water source. No one wasted energy making things look neat. Survival paths only. Beauty could wait for spring. Snow was heavy after a storm, wet and stubborn. It clung to everything. Roofs had to be checked carefully. If too much snow remained, the weight could slowly crush the beams. Someone climbed up, moving cautiously, knocking snow down in thick sheets that fell with dull thuds. Inside the longhouse, life resumed in quiet motions. Someone stirred a pot. Someone mended a tear in a cloak. Children were kept close, wrapped tightly, told to stay inside where it was warm. There was no celebration after surviving a storm. No shouting, no cheering. Survival was expected, not praised. Instead, there was a calm acceptance. This was winter. This was life. Animals were checked next. Sheep and goats huddled together, eyes wide, breath steaming. Some were weak, others restless, but alive. Losses, if there were any, were acknowledged silently. Nothing was wasted. Even in death, animals provided warmth and food. The land looked frozen and empty, but the Vikings knew better. Under the snow, life waited. Seeds slept. Roots endured. Streams still moved beneath ice. Winter was harsh, but it was not an ending. As the day passed, movement slowed. Energy had to be saved. The body burned more fuel just staying warm. People ate small meals more often, keeping strength steady, rather than wasting it all at once. Nights after storms felt different, quieter, heavier. The wind no longer screamed, but the cold felt deeper, more settled. The fire crackled steadily, watched carefully. No one wanted to relive the terror of darkness and cold combined. Sleep came easier after hard labor. Muscles ached, hands throbbed, but the body welcomed rest. Wrapped in thick furs, surrounded by familiar breathing, people drifted into deep, heavy sleep. Dreams often followed storms. Dreams of summer seas, of green hills, of warmth on bare skin. Dreams reminded them why endurance mattered. In the days that followed, routines returned. Tools were repaired. Nets were checked. Plans were adjusted. Winter demanded flexibility. What worked last year might not work this one. Stories were told again, but quieter now. Less about gods and giants, more about memories. Do you remember the winter when the river froze solid? Do you remember when the snow buried the door for 3 days? These memories became lessons, passed down gently, without fear. The children listened. They always did, even when pretending not to. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the days grew longer. Not enough to celebrate, just enough to notice. A few extra moments of light in the morning, a faint glow lingering in the evening. That was how hope returned in the Viking world, not all at once, not loudly, but quietly. 1 minute of light at a time. They didn't rush the season. They didn't fight it. They lived inside it, adapting, adjusting, enduring. Winter was not something to escape. It was something to move through. And so they dug out, cleaned up, and continued. Because that was what their ancestors had done. And what their children would one day do too. The storm became a memory. The cold remained. Life went on. Clothing was never just clothing in the Viking world. It was protection, shelter, and survival all woven into one. Every layer had a purpose. Closest to the skin was linen, soft and breathable, helping absorb moisture. Sweat in winter was dangerous. If it stayed against the skin, it could freeze quickly once the body slowed down. The Vikings understood this through experience, not science. Over the linen came wool, thick, heavy, and slightly rough. Wool was their greatest ally. Even when damp, it held warmth. It trapped tiny pockets of air, keeping heat close to the body. Sheep were not just animals. They were living sources of survival. Cloaks were large and simple, fastened at the shoulder with a pin. They could be wrapped tightly against the wind or loosened near the fire. At night, the same cloak became an extra blanket. Nothing had only one use. Everything had to work twice, sometimes 3 times. Fur was used carefully. Not everyone wore it all the time. Fur was heavy and valuable. It was saved for the coldest days, the longest journeys, the nights when the fire burned low. Fox, bear, seal, and reindeer fur each had different qualities, chosen based on need. Hands and feet received special attention. Fingers lost function quickly in cold, and toes even faster. Gloves were thick, sometimes lined with fur, often tied with cords so they wouldn't be lost in snow. Socks were not separate items but part of long woolen foot coverings, layered carefully inside sturdy leather shoes. Boots were filled with dry grass or moss for extra insulation. When the grass became damp, it was replaced. This simple trick kept feet warm even in deep snow. No metal touched the skin. Metal stole heat too quickly. Hoods were common, pulled low against the wind. Scarves wrapped the neck and face, leaving only eyes exposed during storms. Beards, though natural, also helped trap warmth. No one shaved in winter unless absolutely necessary. Children wore smaller versions of adult clothing, often patched many times. Size was less important than warmth. Clothes were adjusted, folded, tied, and reused until nothing more could be done with them. Clothing was repaired constantly. By the fire, someone was always stitching, patching, or reinforcing seams. A small hole could mean cold air slipping in, and cold air could mean sickness or worse. There was no shame in worn clothes. In fact, heavily patched garments showed experience. They told stories of storms survived and winters endured. When traveling, Vikings layered even more. They planned clothing the way others planned weapons. Too little, and the cold would take you. Too much, and you would sweat, which was just as dangerous. Balance mattered. At night, clothing stayed on. No one slept in bare skin. Layers were loosened but never removed. Boots were kept close to the fire, never too near, just warm enough to stay flexible. Before sleep, cloaks were shaken to remove snow and ice. Wet clothing was dried slowly. Rushing could damage wool and leather. Patience was part of staying warm. In the dark, wrapped in layers, bodies slowly released the day's tension. Heat shared itself through closeness. Breath slowed. Muscles softened. Clothing held warmth, but knowledge held life. This understanding passed quietly from parent to child, from elder to youth. No books, no rules written down, just practice, memory, and survival. The Vikings didn't conquer winter by force, they dressed for it. Fire was more than warmth for the Vikings. It was comfort, safety, and a quiet reminder that they were still alive. In winter, the fire rarely went out. Letting it die meant starting again in the cold, which could take hours and precious energy. So embers were carefully preserved overnight, tucked beneath ash, waiting to be brought back to life with a gentle breath in the morning. Inside the longhouse, the hearth was the heart of everything. People slept near it, cooked beside it, worked around it, and gathered their thoughts in its soft glow. The light was dim, never bright, but enough to chase away the deepest shadows. There was no glass, no lamps like we know today. Light came from flames, oil, or fat. Simple stone lamps burned animal fat with a twisted wick of fiber or moss. The flame was small, steady, and calm. It did not flicker wildly. It soothed rather than startled. At night, this gentle light helped keep fear away. Winter nights were long, silent, and heavy. Outside, the wind howled. Snow pressed against walls. Animals moved unseen. The fire reminded everyone that the world inside was still safe. Stories were often told by firelight, not loudly or with excitement, but slowly. Familiar tales, repeated many times. Stories of ancestors, gods, journeys, and lessons. These stories helped pass the time and ease the mind before sleep. Children listened with heavy eyes. Elders spoke with soft voices. The rhythm of speech mixed with the crackle of wood created a natural lullaby. Even adults found their thoughts drifting as flames danced gently. The fire also dried clothing, boots, and bedding. Dampness was dangerous. Wet wool stole heat. Wet leather became stiff and cold. Everything was turned, moved, and watched carefully so it would dry without burning. Smoke filled the air, drifting upward and escaping through holes in the roof. It stung the eyes at times, but people grew used to it. Smoke even helped preserve wood and deter insects. It became part of the winter atmosphere. Before sleep, the fire was reduced, not extinguished. Logs were arranged so they would burn slowly through the night. Someone always checked it one last time, making sure it was safe, steady, and warm enough. In the quiet hours, the fire became a companion. It popped softly, breathed gently, and cast moving shadows along the walls. These shadows were familiar, almost comforting. They marked time when the night felt endless. When sleep finally came, it came slowly. Bodies relaxed near the warmth. Breath deepened. Thoughts softened. Outside, winter ruled completely. But inside, the fire held its ground. The Vikings understood that warmth was not only physical. Light mattered. Routine mattered. Familiar sounds mattered. Together, they kept despair away during the darkest months of the year. Winter could freeze the land, but fire kept the spirit alive. In the deepest part of winter, warmth was rarely a private thing. For the Vikings, surviving the cold meant staying close, both physically and emotionally. Sleeping alone was uncommon, especially during harsh winters. Bodies were sources of heat, and sharing that heat could mean the difference between comfort and suffering. Families slept side by side, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, breathing the same warm air beneath shared blankets. Children slept near parents. Elders rested where the warmth was strongest. Even visitors were offered a place among others, because no one should face the cold alone. Privacy mattered less than survival. This closeness created a quiet sense of security. The sound of another person's breathing nearby was comforting. It reminded everyone that they were not isolated against the long night. In the darkness, small movements, gentle sighs, and shifting blankets became familiar sounds. Animals sometimes shared the space as well. Dogs curled up near people, adding warmth and companionship. Livestock were often housed close to or beneath living spaces, their body heat rising through wooden floors and packed earth. The smell was strong, but the warmth was valuable. The longhouse itself encouraged togetherness. One large space, many lives moving within it. There were no separate heated rooms, no distant corners untouched by cold. Everyone experienced winter together. This closeness also helped people stay calm. Winter could be mentally heavy. Days were short. Darkness lingered. Being near others eased fear and loneliness. Even without words, shared presence offered reassurance. Before sleep, people adjusted bedding carefully. Furs were layered on top, woven blankets beneath. Bodies were positioned so warmth stayed trapped. Once settled, movement was minimal. Shifting too much let the cold sneak in. Sleep came slowly but deeply. Exhaustion from daily work made rest easier. The body learned to conserve heat, breathing slowed, muscles relaxed, and warmth gathered beneath layers of fabric and flesh. Dreams were shaped by firelight, memories, distant winds, and old stories heard earlier in the evening. Even in sleep, the winter world remained close, but it no longer felt threatening. Morning came quietly. Breath appeared as mist in the cold air. People stirred slowly, reluctant to leave shared warmth. The first person to rise often tended the fire, bringing life back to the room, while others remained still, savoring the last moments of rest. Through closeness, patience, and routine, the Vikings endured nights that might otherwise have broken them. Together, they faced winter, not as individuals, but as a living, breathing group. Cold could isolate, but closeness kept them strong. Winter days for the Vikings were shaped by rhythm. When the cold ruled the land, routines became a quiet form of protection. They did not rush their mornings. Waking up too quickly meant exposing the body to cold air before it was ready. People stayed wrapped in blankets while the fire was revived. Only after warmth returned did movement begin. Morning tasks were simple and steady. Wood was added to the fire. Leftover embers were carefully stirred back to life. Water was warmed slowly, not wasted. Every action was measured, saving both energy and heat. Meals were warm and filling. Soups, stews, and porridges were common, not just for nutrition, but for comfort. Warm food traveled through the body, helping hands and feet regain feeling after a cold night. Daylight was precious. During winter, the sun stayed low and disappeared early. Vikings learned to work with light, not against it. Tasks were planned carefully. There was no rushing, no unnecessary effort. When darkness returned, evenings became calm and predictable. Fires were fed again. Tools were repaired. Wool was spun. Simple tasks kept hands busy and minds settled. This gentle activity helped the body stay warm without exhaustion. Storytelling often filled the long nights. Not loud or dramatic, but steady and familiar. Old stories, family memories, and quiet humor passed from person to person. These moments eased fear and reminded everyone that winter would not last forever. Before sleep, people prepared carefully. Wet clothes were dried near the fire. Bedding was shaken and rearranged. Layers were adjusted to trap warmth more effectively than the night before. Experience taught them what worked. There was a deep respect for rest. Sleep was not wasted time. It was recovery. It was protection. The body needed long hours of rest to face the next cold day. Night routines were almost ritual-like. Fires were banked, not extinguished, allowing embers to last until morning. Doors were sealed. Drafts were blocked with cloth or wood. Silence settled slowly. As people lay down, their breathing slowed in unison. Familiar routines told the body it was safe to relax. Outside, snow and wind continued their work, but inside, order remained. These routines did more than keep bodies warm. They protected the mind. Predictability reduced anxiety. Knowing what came next made the darkness less heavy. Winter demanded discipline, but it also offered a slower pace. In that slowness, Vikings found balance. They learned when to move and when to rest, when to speak and when to remain quiet. Through routine, winter became manageable. Not easy, but survivable. As winter stretched on, the Vikings did not rely on warmth alone to survive. They also leaned on belief. When the nights felt endless and the cold seemed endless too, faith and tradition offered comfort that no fire could provide. They believed the world was shaped by powerful forces, both seen and unseen. Winter was not just weather, it was a presence, a season with its own spirit and purpose. Accepting this made the cold easier to endure. Fighting it mentally only brought fear. Many believed the gods watched over them, especially during hardship. Odin, the seeker of wisdom, was often thought to wander during winter nights. Thor, the protector, was called upon to guard homes from danger. These beliefs brought reassurance when storms howled outside the walls. Simple rituals became part of winter life. Before sleep, Quiet words might be spoken, not loudly, but with intention. They were not grand prayers, just gentle requests for safety through the night. Even children learned these habits early. Symbols were important too. Carved markings, amulets, or family objects were kept close during sleep. Not because they physically warmed the body, but because they warmed the heart. Feeling protected helped the body relax, and relaxation made warmth last longer. Winter festivals played a powerful role. Yule, celebrated during the darkest days, was more than a feast. It was a reminder that light would return. Fires burned longer. Food was shared more generously. Sleep during these nights felt safer, wrapped in community and tradition. Stories told during winter nights often carried lessons of endurance. Tales of gods surviving frost giants or heroes overcoming impossible odds reminded listeners that struggle was temporary. These stories shaped how people viewed their own suffering. Children especially benefited from this. Fear of darkness faded when it was filled with familiar stories. Sleep came easier when imagination was guided, not left alone with the cold. Even the act of sleeping itself had meaning. Dreams were sometimes believed to carry messages. A peaceful night was seen as a sign of protection. A restless one reminded people to be cautious the next day. These beliefs did not erase hunger or cold, but they gave people strength to face them calmly. Mental resilience was as important as physical warmth. By trusting their traditions, Vikings found stability in an unstable season. The cold no longer felt like an enemy, but a challenge that had been faced many times before. Winter still demanded respect, but fear no longer ruled the night. When we look back at how the Vikings slept through brutal winters, it becomes clear that survival was never about one single trick. It was not just thick walls, or warm fires, or heavy blankets. It was the careful combination of many small choices, repeated night after night, generation after generation. Their homes were built with patience and knowledge passed down over centuries. Walls of earth and wood held onto heat like memory itself. Roofs bent low against the wind, not fighting it, but guiding it away. Inside, darkness was accepted, not feared, because darkness helped warmth stay close. Fire was treated with respect. It was never wasted, never taken for granted. Even when flames burned low, embers carried life through the night. People slept knowing that a little heat, carefully preserved, could last until morning. Clothing and bedding were layered with purpose. Wool, fur, and linen were not fashion statements. They were shields. Each layer trapped warmth. Each stitch told a story of preparation. Sleeping together was not weakness, but wisdom. Shared warmth meant shared survival. Daily routines shaped the night. Work ended before exhaustion became dangerous. Meals were eaten with intention, warming the body from the inside. Movement slowed as darkness fell, allowing the body to conserve energy. Sleep followed a rhythm guided by nature, not by clocks. Animals were part of this system too. Their presence added warmth, sound, and a sense of life nearby. A stable or byre was not separate from the home, but part of it. Warmth flowed between human and animal, quietly and naturally. Belief filled the spaces that fire could not reach. Stories, symbols, and traditions softened fear. Faith gave meaning to hardship. Winter was no longer just something to endure, but something to understand. What stands out most is how calm their approach was. There was no panic, no constant struggle against the cold. Instead, there was acceptance, preparation, and trust in knowledge earned through experience. The Vikings did not survive winter by overpowering it. They survived by living alongside it. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson they leave behind. Comfort does not always come from control. Sometimes it comes from adaptation, from listening to the world as it is, and finding ways to rest within it. As you settle into your own rest, wrapped in warmth for easier than what they knew, you can let this story drift with you. The longhouses grow quiet. The fire fades to embers. Outside, the snow falls softly, and inside, sleep comes gently at last. Thank you for resting with this story.